For the people of Europe, the long wait is over. The tension, the fear, the anxiety of a decade has lifted. The democracies of Britain and France met with the dictatorships at Munich, in perhaps the first modern summit meeting. The result is a settlement dictated to the Czechs that gives Hitler all he desires. The people of Europe rejoice at the news, believing a new order has come to pass, one that promises a lasting peace, with a commitment by the great powers to negotiation, not war. The continent believes Hitler has no further demands. The Sudetenland joins the Reich. Within months, the illusion of success crashes to ruins. The remainder of Czechoslovakia is torn apart, divided by avaricious neighbors and orchestrated by Germany. The Nazis now target their ambitions upon the state of Poland, demanding the return of German territory given to the Poles after World War I. These demands conceal a dark strategy of endless German eastwards expansion. The product of an insatiable hunger for land is made by Joseph Stalin. The Soviet leader makes an alliance with Hitler. The deal gives Hitler a free hand to destroy Poland. The communists are to be rewarded with half of Poland, pushing their borders westward. In just weeks, the Polish state is torn apart, destroyed, either subsumed into the German Reich as German territory, or subjected to the darkness of occupation by either Nazi or Soviet troops. The Allies stand helpless as the country they promised to aid is overwhelmed. Modern armored and mechanized armies sweep aside the cavalry and foot soldiers of Poland. Then, nothing. After weeks of furious fighting, calm descends on the continent. The time that followed the destruction of Poland in just 5 weeks of frenetic activity came to be called the phony war. The war that wasn't really happening.
Now imagine me in the Maginot Line, sitting on a mine in the Maginot Line. Now it's turned out nice again, the army life is fine.
France and Britain demonstrated their decision to end appeasement and honored their decisions to aid Poland. But the democracies did little to actually help Poland in any material way. They did little that could indirectly help the Poles by distracting or diverting Hitler's attention. France's commander-in-chief Gamelin saw the war only in terms of defending France, repulsing a German attack. This mentality spread down throughout the French army. No attempt was made by France's heavy artillery to shell German industrial towns, which were well within range. Small probing attacks were made into Germany. When the French reached the Siegfried Line, the German equivalent of France's Maginot Line, they stopped. The inactivity, the passive waiting, sapped the moral strength and... A proposal by Churchill to mine Germany's rivers, important arteries to the economy of the Reich, was rejected by both Britain and France on the grounds that reprisals might be provoked. The first death of a British soldier did not occur until December 1939. This was in severe contrast to World War I, when in the same time, phony war. The Germans were in no great haste to raise the pace of the action. They sought to consolidate their gains in Poland. Some German generals thought the army not ready for war and hoped, as many did in Britain and France, that the war might wither away and a peaceful compromise emerge if neither side upset the other. The entire U-boat fleet put out to sea and took up position in the Atlantic. As war broke out, immediate attacks began upon merchant shipping, with clashes between the naval forces. The anchorage of Scapa Flow in Britain's northern Orkney Islands was used as a forward base by the British fleet in attempting to seal the North Sea. On the night of October the 13th, a German U-boat daringly entered the anchorage and torpedoed the huge British battleship Royal Oak, which capsized with the loss of 833 British sailors. In the coming war, the U-boat and the aircraft carrier would become the dominant weapons of naval warfare. But the first encounters of the war at sea involved surface action. Germany had built a fleet of large ships, surface raiders, designed to make long cruises into the oceans, sinking and destroying merchant trade. One such ship was the Admiral Graf Spee. She had sunk Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean and off the coast of South America had fought a battle with British forces, which she had powerfully outgunned. Engine problems forced the Graf Spee to take refuge in the neutral Uruguayan port of Montevideo. In classic subterfuge, the ships of the Royal Navy used false signals to convince the Germans that a massive British fleet was assembling over the horizon. The Germans chose to scuttle the Graf Spee. The encounter was presented to the British people as a great victory. The Graf Spee had taken many British prisoners and transferred these to her supply ship, the Altmark. The Altmark was cornered off the coast of Norway and took refuge in neutral Norwegian waters. A team of British Marines daringly stormed the Altmark and rescued the prisoners. Thus, the British themselves violated Norwegian neutrality. Britain had learned some of the lessons of World War I and immediately introduced convoys against U-boat attack, resources restricting the extent to which escorts could be provided. Churchill, as Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty in charge of Britain's Navy, showed the wild maverick side of his nature. He insisted that defense measures were not enough and demanded search and destroy patrols be launched against submarines. Going against all advice that this was a poor way to deal with U-boats, Churchill rejected the advice of the admirals. The result was that one British aircraft carrier, the Courageous, was sunk and another badly damaged. War was being fought on land in Europe, in the forests of Finland. The global conflict that became World War II was in many ways a number of small wars that broke out at the same time and aggregated. One such conflict was that fought between Finland and the Soviet Union. The fighting which broke out at the end of November 1939 was the direct outcome of the Nazi-Soviet pact, in which Stalin demanded Finland become part of Russia's sphere of influence. The fighting was a result of Finland's rejection of Stalin's demands that their shared frontier be moved further into Finland and that Finnish islands be given to the Soviet Union. The Russians feared invasion and wanted to push their borders further west, as they had done in Poland. Stalin was prepared to offer compromise, but the Finns saw the USSR as an implacable enemy and believed that concession would only bring further Soviet demands. Russian forces attacked across the whole length of the border. The Soviet Union mounted a full invasion of Finland. The Russian soldiers were told that Finnish workers would rise to welcome them as liberators from capitalism. The Finnish army was small and poorly equipped. The Russians outnumbered the Finns by more than 150%, yet their imagined easy advance ended in stalemate. The Finns absorbed and repulsed repeated attacks, and the Russian superiority in air forces was negated by the short Arctic winter day and poor weather. The Russian tanks were neutralized by a simple improvised weapon, the Molotov cocktail, a bottle filled with gasoline and tar, which was thrown into tank engines, setting them on fire. The communist tactics were naive, separating their tanks from their infantry. The Russian armor was hunted down amongst the forests by Finnish infantry on skis. The Russians attempted to swamp the Finns by weight of numbers, using crude human wave mass attacks. The result was massacre by machine gun fire. Throughout the Finnish War and the early stages of the eventual conflict with Nazi Germany, Soviet forces would be severely weakened by the butchery of the Soviet High Command in Stalin's purges. The communist dictator destroyed the leadership of his army through a paranoid fear of plots and planned coup d'etat. Incredibly, the Russian forces had no white winter camouflage or winter survival skills and froze to death through the absence of winter clothing. Finland appealed to the League of Nations. In its last major intervention in world affairs, the League proved as powerless as ever to prevent the war. The USSR was expelled from the League, and all member states urged to support in 1940. The Finns turned to the counterattack and won a series of stunning victories against the Soviets. Whole divisions of communist infantry surrendered, and vast numbers of heavy weapons were captured and turned on the Russians. The Finnish successes brought the Russians to the negotiating table. They also made the Finns believe that ultimate victory was possible and led them to push for a hard bargain with the Soviet Union. These tactical successes were a distracting illusion from the true strategic position that Finland would, in the long run, be crushed by the sheer weight of her larger neighbor. Finland was falsely encouraged by a British and French plan to aid it. In reality, this was a plan to seize neighboring neutral Sweden's iron ore deposits. The Finns judged that it was not a serious offer that Britain and France would really carry through. As the negotiations persisted, the Soviet army reorganized and mounted new, heavier attacks. The Finnish army could take no more for freedom to negotiate in the new Europe. In fighting Finland, the Soviet Union lost more than 200,000 men to the Finns' 25,000. The Red Army lost credibility, and its final success was ignored by the world. The war drove Finland, a democratic nation. Germany supplied Finland with new modern equipment, and the Finns rebuilt a modern army and planned for revenge against Russia. In 1939, the armies which took their place in northern France represented a way of fighting war that is almost remote to the present. The British force that was slowly, unit by unit, being ferried across the Channel to the fields of northern France went under the title of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. It went under the same name as that borne by the British Army in the First World War. The army resembled that of 1980. They had developed from agricultural tractors as armored vehicles to cross the morass of no man's land into the hail of machine gun fire that had made conventional charges by infantry with bayonets and by cavalry with sword or lance bloody killing grounds. The British Expeditionary Force was a conventional traditional army that simply added tanks to the normal structures. The thinking that guided the BEF was the product of severe debate between the wars on what a tank could do. Those who argued for all armoured formations as adopted by Germany were sidelined and defeated. So the BEF was an army where infantry fought on foot, guns were towed to battle and dug in for set-piece bombardments, and cavalry, although now in armoured vehicles, used lightly armoured vehicles that would enable them to fulfill the cavalry's role of scouting and pursuit of defeated infantry. Tanks were attached to the infantry to allow foot soldiers to cross to no man's land. The British Army traditionally was small and professional. France had a different relationship between soldier and state. The tradition of the citizen in arms that dated back to the Revolution remained. As a continental European power with borders with aggressive neighbours, France had traditionally maintained a large army based upon conscription, upon national service, upon the duty of the citizen to the state. Once again, in 1939, their army had been called up, reservists mobilised. It was a massive force of nearly 3 million that stood alongside the British Army. To create this vast army, France had relied on each generation of its young men passing through conscripted national service. The bulk of these vast numbers of reservists were placed in uniform with just a single year's training, as much as 10 or 15 years previously. In terms of military thinking, the French had failed to learn the lessons of World War I, as had the British. French tanks were over 3,000 in number, the equal of those in the German army, and were technically high in quality. But they were designed to accompany infantry, not to act as an independent strike force. The army as a whole was poorly equipped. France was unable to bear the economic cost of supplying such a huge force with mechanized transport. Most of France's guns were towed by horses. They were still horsed cavalry regiments. The infantry marched on foot into battle. Orders were sent by messenger, not by radio or field telephone. The nation which went to war was, however, confident of victory. Opinion polls of the citizens that were soon to wear uniforms showed that 75% of France supported military action against Hitler over Poland. Generals have always stressed the need for focused goals. In this, the French army was devoid of inspiration. Its only goal was to resist. France's army, for one, had been the Battle of Verdun, a complex of forts on the Western Front that had been resolutely defended to the death, with hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. France saw the path to victory in 1939 as making their whole country into a new Verdun, against which Germany could be provoked to attack. Attacks which would break against the fortress walls so decisively that German strength would be destroyed. This tactic produced the Maginot Line of forts, a fantastic complex of defences. In the spring of 1940, the British Army also sent troops into these forts. Many of the fortifications which British soldiers hastily dug and reinforced were attempts to extend the Maginot Line towards the sea. Economy had ended the line at the Belgian border. Britain and France were both centres of large worldwide empires, and often the soldiers both countries deployed were troops from these empires. Indian troops were seen in the fields of France as part of the British Army. France deployed many troops from its Army of Africa. Some of the forces that were being assembled against Germany were Poles, who had undertaken incredible journeys, escaping via Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey and the Middle East. In particular, clung to the belief that Germany might still be persuaded to listen to reason and negotiate a peace. For several months, the Royal Air Force scattered leaflets all over Western Germany, setting out a logical, reasoned case against Nazi expansion into Europe. There appeared to be no effect on public opinion in the Third Reich. The only value of the raids was in training crews in navigation over Germany at night. Few Europeans may have given much thought to the vicious war that was being fought in China by the army of the Empire of Japan. Little did the people of Europe envisage that the war in Asia would link together with the fighting in Europe. Japan was fighting to occupy and control the resources of China, a vast but weak and chaotic country. Japan sought to eventually replace the European powers as the imperial master in Asia. European colonies such as Hong Kong strengthened their defenses, fearing the war might spread across from China. The war itself was a complex tangle of wars, of conflict within conflicts. China fought Japan, but within that war, two Chinas fought Japan. The nationalists, the official government of China, and the communists, the alternative government. Within this war, the nationalists and communists continued their own civil war. In April 1940, the phony war disappeared and broke into real action. Germany mounted an invasion of the neutral Scandinavian country of Norway. Hitler saw Norway as a weak northern flank. The remote port of Narvik in the far north of Norway was the outlet for Swedish iron ore, essential for the German war effort. During the Finnish-Russian War, France and Britain had planned to seize the port, denying it to German shipping on the pretext that they were aiding the Finnish fight against Russia. This scheme was abandoned after the Finnish collapse against the Soviets. Germany's war effort was largely economically self-sufficient and did not depend on international trade. For those resources which Germany did not possess, rubber and oil, advanced technology had found exact substitutes, which could be created from coal. One of the few materials which Germany needed to import for its armament industry was ore, with which to produce the highest grade steels. These had to be obtained from Scandinavia, actually from the neutral country of Sweden, but via the equally neutral Norway. Britain's war resources were dependent on free Atlantic sea trade. Shipping came under intense attack. The Navy was to gain further coastline from which to base U-boats and surface raiders. The coast of Norway, with its fjords and deep inlets, provided a series of harbors and bases to the Germans that would enable them to threaten merchant shipping and evade the efforts of the Royal Navy to counterattack. Norway and Sweden were countries walking the tightrope of neutrality. In a war which depended on internationally traded materials, it would be increasingly difficult to remain neutral and have neutrality respected. If Germany violated Norwegian neutrality, so did Britain and France. At the same time as the attack upon Norway, the Nazis turned against Denmark. Denmark had remained a neutral country in every European affair since 1815 and was accepted by all powers as part of Germany's backyard. Denmark was by nature pacifist in politics, with the military held in low regard. In 1940, the Danish army was just 14,000 strong. The Navy had just 5 ships. The Air Force had 50 planes. The invasion of Denmark began at 4:15 a.m. on the morning of April the 9th. The Danish government capitulated just 1 hour and 45 minutes later. Denmark was attacked, because she was an innocent bystander in the path of the attack upon Norway. All the countries that were to come under occupation in the war had to choose how to deal with their conqueror. Denmark chose the path of least resistance. As a result of the capitulation, the Danish government retained power over Denmark's internal affairs. The price was what some called collaboration. Yet it was a policy supported by elections. For the Danish population, it was a recipe for survival. Norway had hoped to remain neutral. Although comparable in size to Denmark, its armed forces were stronger. The country was to provide a stronger resistance to the Nazis. Norway had its own Nazi party, and its leader, Vidkun Quisling, was installed by the Germans as president of the occupied Norway. His name was to become synonymous with treachery and collaboration, as he tried to impose a Nazi system on the country. As the Germans mounted their invasion, their troops embarked, their aircraft and ships fueled and armed. They were taking part in a carefully planned operation to grab the resources needed to further fight the war. History conceals from us the confusion endured by both sides in defense. They were involved in an offensive operation of their own. There had been intensive pressure in Britain to end the phony war, to do something. Britain and France had decided, unbeknownst to Germany, to lay mines in Norway's coastal waters. The aim was to force German shipping out from Norway's neutral waters into the open sea, where they could become victim to British destroyers and submarines. The mining operation ran into the German invasion. Hastily, the British revived the plan to occupy Norway. It was planned badly, poorly controlled, and from the first to the last, an operation conducted in a climate of confusion. The action started badly. Units embarked on ships, got off their ships, were ordered back aboard, leaving behind their heavy artillery. An amphibious operation, it was planned by admirals and generals who so jealously kept their independence, they traveled in separate ships. The fighting was to be amongst the sub-Arctic mountains and fjords of Norway. Yet ordinary British infantry were pitted in combat against special mountain troops of Germany. Troops were sent without anti-aircraft units, only to be subjected to constant Stuka attack. Despite some determined action by the Royal Navy, the poorly equipped and organized British troops were pounded from the air and driven to constant retreat by the mountain troops, led by some of Germany's best generals. After just 2 weeks of fighting, the Germans were in complete control of the south of Norway, and British and French troops were undertaking the first of what were to be a series of desperate evacuations by sea. The initiative for this action came from Churchill and displayed his inclination of proposing wild strategic adventures on the fringe of war at its very worst. It was a habit which had caused his downfall once before. In World War I, just such a similar venture into Turkey at Gallipoli had caused the deaths of many thousands and had even threatened the British Empire. Fear and hesitancy that Gallipoli was being repeated only contributed to the failure of the Norway campaign. The combination of the utter surprise which the Germans managed to effect and the chaotic organization of the British and French forces meant that just such a fate might have again awaited Churchill. Instead, the events in Norway were to project Churchill to the height of power. The disaster that might have consigned Churchill to the footnotes of history catapulted him to a paramount position. He became a man of destiny. The timeline of the war is a complex weave of events, of cause and effect tangled together. Already elsewhere in Europe, the war shifted into a higher gear. A picture was being drawn upon a bigger canvas as the German invasion of France and the Low Countries began. Yet in Britain, the chain of cause and effect that spread from the Norway campaign was still to play out. The government had been led by Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain has earned an unfortunate place in history as the principal architect of appeasement, forever to be associated with the Munich Agreement that had consigned Czechoslovakia to oblivion, with promises reneged and trust betrayed. Chamberlain, in fact, only represented the views of nearly everyone in Britain and her ally France. Chamberlain's mistake was to take Hitler at his word. He had compounded his fall in the eyes of history by a series of dramatic speeches that were all too quickly to be confounded by events, to the discredit of the man. On his return from Munich, describing a meeting with Hitler where the dictator had made a vague agreement never to go to war with Britain, Chamberlain had waved a single sheet of paper and famously promised peace in our time. A principled man, Chamberlain had been devastated by the outbreak of war, seeing it as a failure of his political life. The conduct of the war was as much a product of his clinging to a desire that somehow a peace might be grabbed, even at that late stage. While he led Britain, no bomb fell on German territory. After 6 months of the phony war, on April the 6th, as the Germans were leading their invasion fleet for Norway, Chamberlain had made a speech where he famously declared, "Hitler has missed the bus." He confidently predicted victory, arguing that Hitler had failed to act while Britain and France were still arming for war. Once again, Chamberlain's words were soon to be ridiculed by events as the war began in earnest. A debate in Britain's House of Commons was called to discuss the Norwegian campaign. The House met for 2 days in continuous session. Member after member rose to criticize Chamberlain. Aged war heroes came to the House in uniform and medals and stood in condemnation. Famously, Leo Amery, one of the most visibly shaken, he left the House with chants of "Go, go, go" resounding in the chamber. Chamberlain, in fact, did not relinquish power easily. He asked the opposition parties, principally the Labour Party, to join a coalition government. The Labour leader, Attlee, refused, saying Labour would only serve under a different Prime Minister. Chamberlain held a meeting with King George VI, Churchill, and the most senior minister, Lord Halifax, who was Britain's Foreign Secretary. Halifax was the choice of those in government to succeed Chamberlain. The King asked Halifax to form a government. Halifax declined. Uncharacteristically, Churchill achieved his life's ambition by remaining silent. Churchill was chosen because of his disassociation from the politics of appeasement. He alone, of politicians outside the central establishment of British politics, had an arsenal of political and strategic creativity, coupled with instinctive, innate, and powerful talent for the game of war. He himself later remarked on his taking office, "I thought I knew a great deal about it all, and I was sure I should not fail." As he became British Prime Minister, Churchill regarded himself as fulfilling a personal destiny. Churchill's rise to power was the last act of a course of events started by the fighting in Scandinavia. One of Churchill's acts in those first days of office displayed a wise prescience. Taking the advice of RAF officers, he forbade sending more units to France, reasoning they would be fighting a lost cause. These planes had a place in another battle, the Battle of Britain that was to follow. Next time on World War II, The Complete History, the population of Europe comes to yearn for the years of the phony war, as all expectations of victory, all predictions of how things will be, are wiped away in weeks.